Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. I hope you guys are doing all right. And as you'll recall from last time, we talked about the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima that would ultimately lead to the end of World War II altogether. And I hope you guys found that pretty enjoyable because this year is, in fact, the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II altogether. And while we're still talking about the war in the Pacific, today I want to dial it back a little bit and talk about another major significant land battle that took place early in World War II. And folks, that particular battle that I'm referring to is the Battle of Guadalcanal, which took place from August 1942 and lasted all the way until February of 1943. Now, for those of you who don't know, the island of Guadalcanal is considered to be one of the southernmost Solomon Islands in the Pacific. Now, what was so important about this particular battle? Well, a lot of people considered the Battle of Guadalcanal to be one of the first major American offenses on land that we had executed during World War II. And along with this particular battle and the naval battle of Midway, which we talked about earlier, it took place from June 3rd to 6th, 1942. Both of them served as turning points in favor of the Americans and other allies fighting in the Pacific during World War II. So, the Battle of Guadalcanal officially begins on August 7th, 1942, when 6,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division invade this small island in the southern Solomons. Now, the 1st Marine Division was led none other than Major General Alexander Vandegrift, who he and his men launched an ambiguous assault on both Guadalcanal and as well as Florida Island. Now, that initial assault surprised the estimated 2,000 Japanese soldiers that defended that particular island at that time, so it really caught them off guard for the most part. Now, like I said, the landings were very strong. I mean, initially there was very little to no resistance whatsoever from the Japanese, surprisingly. And the airfield on Guadalcanal and the harbor located in Florida Island were seized within the first 36 hours of the battle. Now, this particular airstrip that they captured, the Marines decided to name this particular airfield Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, who was a Marine aviator fighter pilot who sacrificed his life leading a charge during the Battle of Midway back in June of 1942. The Marines didn't know that Henderson Field would go to become the central part of the Battle of Guadalcanal. Even though in the first 2 days of the battle, the Japanese really didn't react that much, starting early in the morning on August 9th, the Japanese launched a strike against the naval forces that supported the operation. And this is due to the part of a force of Japanese cruisers and destroyers that engaged the Allied fleet in a ferocious night battle, which would later become known as the Battle of Savo Island. Now, what was the result of this particular battle? Well, quite frankly, it was pretty disastrous for the Marine and Allied soldiers that were on the island, because the result of this was very drastic, because in the course of 30 minutes or so, the Japanese sank the U.S. cruisers of the Astoria, the Quincy, and the Vincennes, and also crippled the Australian cruiser, the Canberra. This would begin a naval battle along with a land battle on Guadalcanal, but over the next several months that the battle took place, there would be some 24 ships on both sides that would be lost. The initial assault on the southern island of Guadalcanal comprised of a unique combination of air, naval, as well as ground troops to begin this assault. With the help of Army Air Force bombers, they were able to flatten the ground enough for Marine infantrymen to invade the island on certain strategic points and basically overrun the enemy from where they were. And because of all this huge force against the Japanese, the Marines were able to hold certain key points throughout the island. almost as soon as the Marines assaulted Guadalcanal, the Japanese, of course, they were retreating, but while they were doing so, they were coming up with a new strategy to try to combat the invaders of their precious island and try to take back what was once theirs. Now, the Japanese commanders began making preparations for this particular thing because they knew at one point or another something like this was bound to happen whatsoever. Now, while all this is going on, Commander Vandegrift had concentrated some 11,000 Marines into this tight offensive perimeter around Henderson Field, that new airstrip I was telling you about. Even though the Japanese had a plan of attack against the Americans, in the end, they greatly underestimated the strength of the American forces that were on that island. In fact, the Marines had at one point annihilated a unit of about 900 veteran Japanese Army soldiers whenever they tried to invade Henderson Field once again. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that just shows that how much brute force the Marines had at that particular point in time. I mean, the Marines normally are always battle hard. I mean, they have some of the strenuous exercises to prepare them from war compared to some other branches or whatsoever. So I say all that to mean the surprise attack from the Japanese was not a surprise for the Marines. I mean, they were overly prepared for anything and everything that was going to be thrown at them for sure. Now, there are some things, some sides where the Japanese did try to gain the upper hand because Japanese ships and aerial bombers tried to shell our positions around Henderson Field, and they actually did become routine for the most part. However, what they did not take away from us is our will to keep this island no matter what. Now, to combat the Japanese Air Force and bombers that were routinely trying to bomb our troops on land, there was a combination of Marine, Army, Air Force, as well as Navy pilots that would go around the island and take out these particular Japanese planes and bombers. Now, this particular group of fighters became known as the Cactus Air Force. And over the course of the first 4, maybe 5 weeks of the battle, the aviators from this Air Force were able to take out more than 150 Japanese planes whatsoever from bombing our guys on the ground. That's pretty impressive, really, that all the branches of the military came together and were able to do all of this to protect our boys down there. Now, the fighting continued for the most part. In fact, from September 13th through 14th, U.S. Marine Colonel Merritt Edson, 800 Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion, as well as a handful of Marine parachute troops, were subjected to one of the most intense assaults on Henderson Field so far, in that they were attacked by a Japanese force about 3 times their size. However, their tenacious defense would soon become called the Battle of Edson's Ridge, helped to cement the reputation of the Raiders in Marine lore, and it also earned Edson the Medal of Honor for his bravery and tenacity in that particular battle. Now, the Japanese at the height of this battle reached an approximate strength of about 36,000 soldiers or men, and that was in October of 1942. But even at that many men to try to take back the island, they were still unable to overwhelm the Americans and to get us to leave their island. I mean, they were not able to succeed whatsoever. Now, the hardest fighting of this particular battle, I would say, occurred between October 24th and 25th, 1942. On those particular days, a single Marine battalion was all that stood between Henderson Field and 2 Japanese regiments. Now, for a lot of you guys that have seen it, this particular battle is seen in great detail in the HBO miniseries, The Pacific. I mean, it goes into great detail, this particular battle, and if you guys have never seen that show, you really do need to watch it, but it's amazing how they portray history so well these days. On that particular day, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marine Division, who was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Chesley Polar, repelled Japanese assault and inflicted heavy casualties on their attackers. Now, the Marines were enforced by soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment, who was considered by many to be the first U.S. Army regiment that landed on Guadalcanal to assist the Marines. Now, Polar's Marines weathered repeated Japanese charges and held their positions. While all this is going on, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone would go on to receive the Medal of Honor for literally carrying a heavy, hot machine gun and firing it on the Japanese when they were needing to change positions a lot. I mean, he literally burned his hand to try to take out the Japanese and move this gun so that he could take out a lot of the soldiers that were attacking them. But for his valiant action in that particular battle, he would go on to win the Medal of Honor for his role in the Battle of Guadalcanal. And this particular battle would also earn Polar his 3rd Navy Cross out of a total of 5 for his career for his brilliant action during that battle. Now, by November, the U.S. Navy was able to land reinforcements on Guadalcanal faster than the Japanese. Basically, at this point in time, the Allies greatly outnumbered the Japanese by many factors, for sure. Now, in December, the 1st Marine Division was officially withdrawn from the main fighting, and the U.S. 25th Infantry Division began arriving on Guadalcanal. At the start of 1943, the total number of Allied soldiers on Guadalcanal stood to about 2 U.S. Army divisions, as well as a single Marine regiment, against approximately 12, maybe 15,000 Japanese soldiers that remained on the island at that time. Now, the offenses continued through January of 1942, and which greatly narrowed and suppressed the Japanese position. But during the first week of February, the light surface craft began evacuating the 12,000 remaining Japanese forces from Guadalcanal. So once that happened, on February 8th, 1943, the Guadalcanal is officially in U.S. hands and the battle is all over. It was a hard one, but very good victory for the United States for sure. And they're often considered the first land battle of the Pacific War. That was a major accomplishment for us, and it gave us a lot of confidence in the end, especially after we let the Japanese surprise us at Pearl Harbor. I mean, there couldn't have been a greater feeling in the world at that particular time. Now, that doesn't mean that the battle was costly. It most definitely was, but it was more so for the Japanese than anything. Now, of the numbers, today it's estimated that some 24,000 Japanese soldiers lost their lives during the particular Battle of Guadalcanal. Now, compare that to U.S. forces, where we had about 1,600 men killed, about 4,500 wounded, as well as several thousand more dying, not just from battle, but from tropical diseases and all that. Just like how the flu killed more American soldiers in World War I than actual people killed in battle. That's crazy to think about it, but as far as dying in action and all that, there's quite a few less casualties on the American side than the Japanese side. And not only was Guadalcanal a victory for us, but what it proved, for one, they learned the hard way in some aspects that the Japanese will hold on to every square inch of their territory and they won't give it up very easily. Basically, Japan was a hard opponent to beat, but at the same time, we see that the Americans would use new tactics and all that that would be the blueprint of the battles later on during the Pacific War, which would ultimately help us win the war in end of 1945. So, I know Guadalcanal may not be one of the most well-known battles of World War II. I mean, all around there's Stalingrad, there's the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, but it definitely has its place in history. I mean, Guadalcanal was the first major and true land battle that the U.S. participated in the Pacific, at least during World War II. And it also served as a major turning point for us, too. But it also instilled in our Marines, soldiers, and sailors that if we keep doing what we're doing and we keep pushing, anything's possible. And this more than gave us enough confidence and edge to win World War II. So, like before, I also would love to dedicate this particular video to all of our living World War II veterans, as well as those who sacrificed themselves for our country in this particular conflict and this battle during World War II. Thank you guys so much for your service. Now, I hope you enjoyed this content today, and please stay tuned in for next time. And please leave a comment below on what you'd like me to talk about next, and give me some ideas for what you'd like to see and not see. But also leave a like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it, everyone. Well, thank you all, and have a wonderful day.